you have these games that get massive, and are very involving, and you can, instead of just putting the game on pause, if you had a system advanced enough to even have a pause button, and just kind of leaving it under your TV for a while and hope no one bumps it, you could actually save your game, turn the system off, come back to it 2 weeks later and pick up your game. And that was a whole new thing, a whole new world.
I am Dr. Sparkle, and Crontendo is the project which I'm working on, in which I tried to document every video game that was published for the Famicom, the Japanese Nintendo Entertainment System, as well as the US Nintendo Entertainment System, and I'm doing it all in chronological order. But something else I've really learned doing Crontendo is just how quickly the video game industry changed in that relatively short time period. I mean, if you think about it, in 1983, we had stuff like Donkey Kong Jr. being a pretty new game, and then 5 years later, we were having stuff like Super Mario Bros. 3, which had, this long plot. The game was enormously long, had just countless screens and screens of action, all these different abilities and power-ups and stuff, and that was only 5 years. What was coming out in 2006? The original Gears of War or something? I mean, have games really changed that much?
Because a lot of games, when they come out now, 2 weeks later, they're old games and no one wants to play them anymore because they're done with them. But, with the old games, you either didn't need a strategy guide at all because it's just evident what you need to do, or, it's something that, you're in Super Mario 3 and they made a game guide for it because it can get pretty tough as you go work your way through. But, that's also a case of extending your enjoyment of the title. So, yeah, there's a point there where it crossed from, arcade adaptations, basically, or arcade style, to something that requires a lot more intensity.
And I don't think, that's necessarily bad for video games to have scripted events, or to kind of have these, in Super Mario Bros. 3, I called them oh shit moments, where suddenly something exciting happens, because even back then they were doing it. Like in Super Mario Bros. 3, when something like the sun comes down and tries to kill you. That's kind of the equivalent to something in Uncharted 2 where, the train comes crashing through the window or something. It's sort of the same idea, only nowadays we do it on a much more in-your-face, expensive, sort of movie-style blockbuster kind of way.
Newer games that come out, one of the problems you have with the really advanced newest games is that you have these very intense environments to play in. You have these games that tell their story, but sometimes they're done in 25 to 30 hours, and you don't have as much interest to pick it up again after you're finished with the story. It's like watching a movie that, some people will buy a movie that they cherish and keep it, but a lot of times people will be just happy to rent it, watch it, and go on to the next thing. There's a lot of games coming out like that. They're $50, $60 to buy, whereas Asteroids is a pick up and play game, but you're going to play that for 10 years. You're going to go back to it because it's still going to be Asteroids. Not maybe every day, not with a huge zeal after the thing wears off, but it's still going to be sitting there beckoning for you to go back and see if you can beat your last score. So in some ways, the simpler games have longer enjoyment in them than some of the newer games that initially play longer but have no replayability.
When you go to any of these indie game awards or look at some of these indie games that are out right now, a lot of them do really have that same style and that same aesthetic as some of these early games, where you're much more likely to encounter a character who's more of a pixelated running man than a more realistic looking character on the screen. And as people are looking back and saying what really made some of these games great, I think they are tending to try to draw some of the gameplay elements out of them, some of the same aesthetics out of them, that there is much more of a respect for those early game titles.
Well, yeah, it seems like in about the last, maybe 5 years or so, there has been sort of a gradually building interest in these sorts of games. But now even the actual mainstream video game industry has suddenly embraced them in a way they hadn't really before. like with the new Mega Man games, or 3D Dot Hero. What's that thing called? 3D Dot Game Heroes, a game that I'm actually playing right now and still cannot remember the title of.
You look at a game like Super Mario Brothers that came out for Nintendo during the mid-'80s, and you look at on the Nintendo Wii out right now, Super Mario Brothers Wii. Someone that hadn't played a video game in that 25-year period in between the two of them, they would feel very comfortable playing the modern Nintendo Wii game, because the game designers, it's a 2D platformer game, and although the level designers did a great job of creating new worlds and new levels for the modern Wii game, it really does feel very similar to playing that classic Nintendo game during the 1980s. So I think a lot of folks look at these characters, they look at the games, and they say, what is it that we can do to keep the same feel, to keep the same characters, but to kind of take a slightly different twist on it.
Yeah, I mean, for the NES, so many of those titles came out at a certain time in people's lives that they could really peg. They could remember owning it for the first time, or they could remember wanting to own it the first time. I mean, that's another part that's big about vintage, is that kids who have the budgets given to them by their parents can only get so many things. Adults, a lot of times, can just go out and spend a couple $100s in a used game store and have everything they ever wanted. So, yeah, I mean, it's complete nostalgia, and it's also, wish fulfillment at the same time.
People who grew up with the Famicom or NES are now at that age where they have a certain amount of leisure time. I mean, they're often old enough that they have a steady job, and they, are looking for, I guess, they can now suddenly afford to relive the parts of their childhood they didn't get around to back then.